on yesterday, we left the radio. I was in Philippians chapter number 2, verses 12 and 13. Paul the Apostle says, "But work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure." Now, in the matter of faith and works, somebody will say, "But Brother Ben, doesn't the Bible say work out your own salvation?" Paul said, work out your own salvation. There's a good man, and I appreciate this man's memories with the Lord now in heaven. He was a good man, and I appreciate him. This is not a derogatory comment at all, not at all. But I used to hear him preach a great deal, and he would draw out Philippians 2:12 like a .38 revolver. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And the man was not preaching work salvation. No, I had far too much confidence in him for that. But he did draw that out and make the quote without consistently quoting the latter part of the verse. For it is God which worketh in you. Now, we saw yesterday that Abraham's faith preceded Abraham's works. If Abraham had not had faith, he would have never climbed Mount Moriah and would have never offered his son Isaac as an offering. If Abraham had not had faith that God would raise Isaac from the dead, he would have never climbed Mount Moriah and offered his son as an offering there. His faith preceded his works. And so the same principle I find here in the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter number 2, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So I have the conclusion given first. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Now, if God has not worked salvation in, the born-again believer has nothing to work out. Now, I know that there are men that are occupied in the area of self-righteousness, and we have a lot of self-righteousness and a lot of men and a few women trying to work their way to heaven. If working and praying has any reward, surely I'll make it in. I can hear some of them saying, I'm climbing up the rough side of the mountain, and I'm trying to endure and hold out faithful unto the end. I can hear them over and over reciting those mantras. There are a lot of works, and I think that there are some people that have a lot of works that have nothing on the inside. There is no salvation that God has put on the inside. All they have is outward works. So how am I to understand this? Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. The last clause aligns itself with Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. This is where I left the radio yesterday. If you had asked me 40 years ago when I was in college what God was going to do with my life, and the door God was going to open for me, and the door God was going to allow me to have back then, my assessment of what God would do would be different than my realization of what God has done. Now, would I change anything that God has done in my life? No. I'm entirely satisfied with what God has made me, who God has made me. I'm entirely satisfied with the door of opportunity God has allowed me to have. I was always of the opinion that I would pastor, that I would spend my life pastoring a local church. And here I am now after 42 years in the ministry, and I've never pastored a day in my life. Some of the doors and opportunities and areas of influence God has allowed me to have, I could not have conceived of 40 years ago. God has worked all of this in me. In advance of me now having had the Bright Spot Hour for nearly 30 years under my own direction. I had a small radio broadcast that my grandfather encouraged me to develop, and I had that for 11 years. Now we're reaching back more than 40 years. And God was working something in me in those early days that He would work out of me in the last 30. As I've come to this radio mic every day, and we've been able to maintain the Bright Spot Hour now into our 80th year on the air without a break. I would have thought that I would have given myself to the pastorate. But instead, God has allowed me to travel millions and millions of miles and preach. I guess I've run 1,000 revival meetings over the course of my life. It's a miracle what God has allowed, what God has done. I marvel. Now, Paul says we're to work out what God has worked into us. We are to work that out with fear and trembling. Now, I'm afraid that we have some believers, and they are so of the mindset, and I've run into a few men that have made this comment. I had one preacher tell me this now. This is not hearsay. I was there in the room when he said it. He said, I know God is for what I'm for. And I know God is against what I'm against. Whatever I'm against, God's against. And whatever I'm for, God is for. Well, to me, when I heard that statement, I said, well, that's a pretty high-minded statement, especially when I read in the book of Isaiah that my thoughts are, God says my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. I'm afraid we have some men, and they're their own final authority. I mean, they are a law unto themselves, as I read in the Bible. They are their own law. They are their own authority. And I don't know of anything that could be any more dangerous than that. There must be an area of submission, yieldedness. There must be a recognition of Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. In order for me as a born-again believer to follow the exhortation of Paul in Philippians 2:12, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. Now, it'd be wrong for me to assume the attitude, well, I always thought I'd pastor, and I know if I'm thinking I'm supposed to pastor, then that's what God wants for me to do, and I have to do that, and if I don't do that, I'm not fulfilling my purpose in my life that I think God should fulfill in my life. Dr. Oliver Green never pastored a church. Dr. Jack Green never pastored a church, and those men are among my heroes and champions, and neither one of those men ever pastored. There must be a yieldedness, Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good. That God will work His will out in our life as we yield ourselves to Him, as we yield ourselves to the opportunities God gives us, and we don't question the opportunities that some of us think that, well, I should have had a chance to do that, and I didn't. I'm not going to spend the rest of my Christian experience, the rest of my life, saying, well, I wonder why God didn't open that door. The fact is, God didn't open it. And it's none of my business why God may or may not have opened that door or may have closed that door. When you and I understand the work of God in us, then in yieldedness and in faithfulness, we should work that out with fear and trembling. We should recognize that God's will is supreme. Not my will, God's will. And that's vastly different than the man that I heard say, and he's in heaven now, so many years ago, he said, I know God is for what I'm for. I know God is against what I'm against. If I'm for it, God's for it. If I'm against it, God's against it. You know, a saved man cannot work out what he doesn't have. If God has not worked anything in, there's nothing for him to work out. That's why I think there's a vast difference between true righteousness and self-righteousness. True righteousness is not always preoccupied with rules and laws and regulations and standards and things of that nature. Those things will occupy true righteousness, but it'll be a development of it, not a goal to attain. Self-righteousness says, now here's the standard, and you reach this in the energy of the flesh. A man must have salvation first. Before God can do anything else with him, a man must be born again. He must have salvation worked in him before he has anything to work out. So the doctrine the Apostle Paul desires to express was that salvation included more than simply an escape route from hell. Now I rejoice that I'm saved and I'm not going to hell. But salvation, as revealed by the Apostle Paul, entails for the believer and for his effectiveness with other Christians and with the world at large and lost sinners more than just a fire escape out of hell. I mean, we're saved from the power of sin. We are saved from the penalty of sin. We are saved from the presence of sin. But God desires that our lives be effective, that our lives fulfill the purpose of God that He has for us. And the purpose of God is not found, and the effectiveness of my life and your life is not found by me comparing myself to other men and other men comparing themselves to me. The same Apostle Paul that said this told the Corinthian believers, they comparing themselves among themselves and measuring themselves by themselves are not wise. A pastor with 50 people can't say, well, I'm a failure because another pastor has 500. If the pastor with 50 is working out his salvation, he's working out what God put in him, he is in every capacity just as successful as a pastor that has 500. What if the pastor with 500, it was God's purpose for him to have 1,500, and because he refuses to work out what God has worked in, he only runs 500 rather than the potential of having 1,500, you see. Now, I think sometimes we look at this all the wrong way because the flesh, that natural man gets in the way, and the natural man says, well, don't ignore me. I mean, whatever I'm for, God's for. Whatever I'm against, God's against. I know because I am, and I am what I am. And they go on, and it's all the flesh. There must be yieldedness to the purpose of God for our works to be effective to the glory of God. My time is gone. The Lord bless you until our program on tomorrow.
Post Office Box 4, Greenville, South Carolina 29602. This is Mark Ferguson thanking you for listening. Be sure to listen next time for the Bright Spot Hour. Same time, same station, same